This show is a Hopful Media podcast production.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, A History of Valois Burgundy.
If you're listening to this, you probably know that the United States of America gets involved in a lot of foreign wars. We all know the big ones: World War I, World War II, Korea, sort of, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq again. But before and in between all that, the story a lot of us heard in school is that the US military didn't get out much. Turns out, that's kind of a blatant lie. I'm gonna guess a lot of us don't know about the multiple Spanish-American wars, the wars that led up to the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the baffling number of times we invaded Mexico. Odds are you've never even heard of things like the time the Marines invaded Taiwan or the Oconee Wars. I'm Trevor Cully, host of the new podcast America Secret Wars, where I am going to sit down with a guest in each episode and dive into the history of all the forgotten and overlooked times that the United States deployed military force against other nations. You can find America Secret Wars at secretwarspod.com on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Hello, everybody. Welcome to America Secret Wars, a podcast all about the forgotten, overlooked, and deliberately covered up times the United States has used military force to fight or occupy foreign soil. I am your host, who has been up for 14 hours and is going to be fueled entirely by coffee, Trevor Cully. Today, I have Ben with me from the Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast, and I know you've got a second one, but the name escapes me.
Why Tho? A personal journey through my record collection.
Right.
And I am fueled entirely by seltzer.
The real alternative fuel. That's what's going to replace gasoline.
I can't wait till we start having wars over sources of carbon dioxide.
We've got a lot of it in the atmosphere. It's a problem that'll fix itself. Plus, we have all this extra White Claw that nobody really needs to be drinking anyway.
Nope, nobody. Polar all the way, personally. But there are other schools of thought, I suppose.
All right. Well, I have a standard question I like to start these off with now, at least until I start having repeat guests, and then I don't know what I'll do. What was your relationship to American history like in school, high school, college, those kind of basic fundamentals that everybody shares?
I knew more than the teachers most of the time. I started getting into World War II at age 6, and was just a voracious reader, mostly of history, and then massively burned myself out on it by the time I got to high school, and moved on to world history, which is why I have a podcast about early modern Europe and not American stuff.
For anybody not familiar with Ben's work, put early modern in heavy scare quotes.
Okay, so my show starts with the geological formation of the Earth, but, what's a few millennia between friends?
The story going from Wittenberg to Westphalia will one day reach Wittenberg. Maybe.
We're getting close. I'm up to the investiture controversy, so I'm only a few centuries off.
How long have you been doing this now?
5 years.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
I'm writing episode 97 right now, so.
But compared to my other podcast, History of Persia, the geological formation of the Earth to the late Middle Ages is a stellar pace, so you'll be there in no time.
I'm getting there.
All right, but so you did world history and you did some childhood World War II buff stuff. What is the impression you got of the early American military in your education so far? Really, that's part of why I'm doing this podcast.
Okay. So, we're talking pre-Civil War, pre-1812.
Say up to World War I.
Okay. A couple different phases in there, but generally fairly slapdash. Generally viewed by other countries certainly as amateurish and parochial, although their experiences in World War I in any case. But yeah, the American military sort of... so let me break it down like this. Up to the Civil War, amateurish and underfunded, but at least had some basic funding, which was a nice change post-1812. And then after the Civil War, it was, probably one of the strongest militaries in the world, and then was allowed to rapidly decay. Up until, basically, Teddy Roosevelt came along and started building it back up, at least somewhat.
Yeah, some teasers for the next kind of series of episodes we'll have on here. That post-Civil War boom is going to be a major factor, but not yet. But part of why I started this podcast in the first place is because in those first few decades of American history, the line is basically no actual army.
Yeah.
Not a globe-trotting power of any sort.
Certainly not.
And, we were not a world power because we were barely a country.
We kept trying.
But we were shockingly globe-trotting.
Yes.
So, obviously, by 2024, our military has traveled all over the planet. The Navy and the Air Force have even been operating research and training programs in Antarctica since the 1940s. But Ben, if you had to guess, where was the southernmost battle, or armed confrontation, maybe, that we have ever fought?
Well, am I allowed to metagame this?
You are.
Well, I'm going to guess that it's probably the Falkland Islands, given the name of this episode.
Shocking.
If I hadn't had the ability to metagame, I probably would have thought it was some, one ship on ship naval combat in the South Pacific or something. But Falkland Islands, that's my final answer.
Yeah. Yeah, that is what I assumed too, that it would be somewhere in the South Pacific, some weird break-off action during World War II. And then I realized just how far south the Falkland Islands are. They are functionally in Antarctica.
Yeah.
But, yeah, today we are going to talk about the Falkland Islands.
Awesome.
Do you know anything about these clusters of rocks in the southern Atlantic?
Actually, kind of a lot. Maybe not a lot. I'm probably not doing a good job of my role as being the ignorant interlocutor here, but...
No, this is great. Change of pace.
So there turns out there was a fairly major international war there that's still kind of a simmering international conflict now. So I've done a bunch of research on the Falkland Islands as a result in terms of the British conflict with Argentina. So most of my knowledge is in terms of the modern situation and exocet missiles and Mirage fighters and all that stuff. But yeah, so basically a couple fairly big rocks planted in the water, these days mostly occupied by sheep and people who tend sheep. There's a small town, basically, if you want to call it that. They've got a somewhat functional economy now, heavily subsidized by Britain in terms of their international connections. And the closest landmass is Argentina, but that's a whole other conversation, I'm sure, because we're probably not talking about the Falkland War.
We are not, and yet simultaneously we are definitely talking about why there was a Falkland War and how it's kinda sorta America's fault.
Oh, sweet. Okay, this I don't know about.
And just as a spoiler for the rest of the episode, tending sheep is about as advanced as the Falklands have ever been.
There was also killing innocent whales.
That will factor in.
Okay. Good.
Innocent seals will be the more important point, but
sure,
both are relevant.
Cute, intelligent, furry, can kill them.
And full of highly flammable oil.
Yes, excellent. Good.
So today we are going to talk about the Falklands back in the early 19th century, specifically 1831. But since I'm guessing, like most of the countries the United States has invaded over the years, 99% of my listeners don't know anything about the place, I should probably explain some Falklands history first, because 1831 was a weird time on these islands.
Most times are on the Falklands, to be fair.
And I had intended for this to just be a brief overview of the islands, and then we get to the American intersection with Falklands history, because this is nominally an American history podcast. But somehow I kept finding the American military or its veterans in the Falkland Islands while trying to explain how they got there.
Okay.
So, technically, the Falklands, for anybody who doesn't know, are a cluster of islands, but kind of in the same sense as New Zealand, with two big islands, East and West Falkland, surrounded by some smaller rocks. While there is evidence that indigenous people from mainland South America inhabited or visited the islands before European colonization, the islands were not permanently inhabited until fairly recently. Portuguese explorers noticed that they were there as soon as they started sailing around the area, and some European sailors might have stopped on the islands occasionally, but it wasn't until 1690 that an English merchant stopped on the islands intentionally on his way to Peru. He basically saw some rocks and pulled over to have a look around and write down that they were there for the first time.
It really says something about how attractive this landmass is, that during the age of exploration, people repeatedly sailed by it and just went, nah.
Yeah, we are almost 200 years into colonizing every inch of land the Europeans could access. And somebody finally saw these and was like, oh, somebody should know that these are here.
Someone might hit that. I should write that down.
Even after that, it took 70 years before anybody bothered trying to actually live there. Some French colonists set up on East Falkland in 1764, and some English colonists moved in on West Falkland in 1765. These were tiny settlements, and it actually took a while before either colony was aware of the other's existence.
I was going to ask if the English showed up just because the French did, but...
No, as far as anybody can tell, the French settled on the eastern side of the eastern island, the British went to the western side of the western island, and it took a year or two before they ran into each other. To which I assume they said, white people, and were generally surprised. But they were set off the coast of South America, which was, by decree of the Pope, almost entirely Spanish territory. So the Spanish kicked the French out as part of a treaty in 1766, and they actually forced the Brits out at gunpoint 4 years later.
As often characterized Spanish and British relations in this period.
Yeah. And British relations with the Falkland Islands, because this sparked a diplomatic crisis where the British threatened war over ownership of the Falklands until Spain gave their settlement back.
Okay.
Maybe.
Oh, maybe.
The British did not return to the islands in 1770.
They gave them legal title because of the spirit of the thing, and then the British were like, okay, who wants to go back to the Sheeprock? And everyone went,
They're like,
no.
We have one nearby, it's called Scotland.
And the Isle of Man. And there's a lot of places to raise sheep, if we're honest.
Yeah, and if you're British, you really don't need to go to the farthest place away you can possibly go. The British formally withdrew their military presence around the southern tip of South America in 1776 because there was this thing going on with some minor uprising in their American colonies. Nothing to worry about, but I'm sure the couple dozen guys they took from the Falklands helped crush that rebellion in no time.
Yep. Sure did.
Eventually, I will have to stop doing this bit where I act like the American Revolution is a surprise in my History of the United States podcast. So British withdrawal gave Spain an opportunity to step back in and turn the islands into a penal colony, because European colonial powers love prison colonies.
Cool.
But once again, despite being uninhabited islands, colonial power really struggled to hang on to these damn rocks. Napoleon invaded Spain in 1807, and all that chaos created a window of opportunity for revolutionaries in South America, so Spain withdrew its presence on the Falklands in 1811.
And I'm sure the dozen guys they pulled out really helped them reconquer South America.
Yep, that is why Nuevo Hispania is a valued member of the United Nations today.
Yes.
Hey. It went super well for them.
Yes.
Listen to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. This left the Falkland Islands without any sort of formal government, and they quickly devolved back to not having any permanent population. There were always about 1,000 people there, but nobody lived in the Falklands. Mm-hmm. It was just a place for ships hunting whales and seals in the Atlantic to stop over, get some fresh water, and do repairs. Basically pulling into the ruins of the old French, Spanish, and British fortifications as makeshift shelter.
That sounds really unpleasant.
Yeah, on the other hand, their option was to go to the part of Argentina that was a war between Spain, the revolutionaries, and the indigenous people all fighting one another. So, probably the more appealing of the places they could land at the time. Because they weren't going to get shot by any sheep.
Yeah, I suppose.
And this is where I go off on a bit of a tangent, because researching this led me to the most bizarre set of interlocking historical characters I have ever encountered.
Okay.
But it is still technically on topic, because we get to talk about how the Falklands became part of the War of 1812.
Oh boy.
One of America's bigger secret wars that will definitely get its own episode or 7 someday.
And one of my favorites.
So, Joseph Holt was an Irish man.
Okay.
Sort of. His family had been in Ireland for 200 years, but they came over from England in the 1600s as Protestant plantation owners on land confiscated from actual native Irish people.
Great. Okay.
Joseph even joined the Protestant militia to enforce British rule in the 1780s when British regulars withdrew from Ireland to fight in the American Revolution. The
Great.
guys from the Falklands just didn't cut it.
Yeah.
Shocking.
An interesting thing is that Holt is a Dutch name, so that's an interestingly well-traveled family.
Yeah, the Protestantism probably shifted things around a bit for a while.
Yeah, sure.
You would know.
Yes.
But serving as a foot soldier of British colonialism, and it was definitely colonialism in Ireland,
Yes.
actually seemed to give Joseph Holt a change of heart. Despite the fact that he wrote extensive memoirs, the exact explanation for this isn't recorded, but something he saw in this period as a militiaman turned him towards Irish independence, and Joseph joined the Society of United Irishmen sometime in the 1790s.
I love the Society of United Irishmen. They're great.
Yeah, Holt became so pro-Irish that the local English landlord had the militia he had once been a part of burn down his house.
Oh dear.
And he took command as a pro-independence general in the Irish Rebellion of 1798.
Oh dear. I bet that went well.
Yeah, that's why Ireland celebrates its Independence Day from 1798.
So was he at the Battle of Vinegar Hill, or did he survive? I guess he survived.
He did survive. When the rebellion was put down, despite the brief attempt by revolutionary France to invade Ireland, Holt was captured and sentenced to hard labor in the British penal colony of New South Wales, Australia. I promise this relates to the Falkland Islands.
Along with several thousand of his closest friends.
Yeah. Well, he was actually accused of plotting a coup in New South Wales.
This is my kind of guy.
And Holt was sent to a different penal colony on Norfolk Island in the South Pacific.
Okay.
Which was effectively a brutal prison labor camp.
Right.
On a different rock fit only for raising sheep.
Right. Is that the one that's off Tasmania, or is it a different one?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
It's kind of... Tasmania is the closest thing to it, but it is out in the water.
Okay, sure.
He
was at a penal colony that was a penal colony from a penal colony that was a penal colony from a penal colony.
Yes.
He was 3 layers deep into the British.
And eventually he will arrive on a former penal colony.
Okay, great, good. Well, that's where this is going.
But he had the luck of the Irish, because he still had friends in Australia. Except, wouldn't you know, those same friends went and had a coup without him against the governor of New South Wales, one William Bligh, former captain of the HMS Bounty.
If I recall correctly, he was a little bit too harsh on the people in New South Wales.
Yeah, they, his crew on the Bounty famously mutinied against him because he was an abusive dick to every subordinate he ever had, and that carried over to his time as governor.
Yeah.
Without an official governor, Joseph Holt couldn't receive his official pardon from the British Crown and begin his journey back to Europe until December of 1812.
Okay.
So he had to wait for there to be a governor in Australia to pardon him, to get him out of Norfolk, to get back to Australia and start sailing home. Well, there's no Panama Canal yet. We haven't done that secret war. So they were crossing the Straits of Magellan in late February 1813 and coming up the eastern side of South America. That's when the ship carrying Joseph Holt and a few of his friends, called the Isabella, ran aground off Speedwell Island, a tiny speck off the southern coast of East Falkland.
That's probably the last place in the world I'd want to get shipwrecked, to be honest.
Yeah, in 1813, not a great time.
No.
There were 54 survivors, and 6 of them volunteered to take a small sailboat from the wreckage and find a Spanish outpost to get help.
Yeah.
But they were functionally on abandoned islands, so this tiny sailboat sailed out into open waters for a full month before they reached the mainland.
Oh, God, that's awful.
Meanwhile, Holt and the other survivors were just kinda hanging out on the Falkland Islands. They got off Speedwell and moved over to the big one where they could see, like, signs of animal life.
Got some sheep.
But they were still there in early April.
Yeah.
That is when an American seal hunting ship called the Nanina came through the area and noticed the sounds of gunfire and plumes of smoke from camp rising off of these supposedly deserted islands. So the captain of the Nanina, one Charles Barnard, sent men ashore to look for castaways, the only reasonable explanation for why there would be signs of life here. And sure enough, they found them. Barnard met Joseph and the other survivors, gave them food, and a promise of rescue, along with some important news. Remember, this is a British ship that was shipwrecked. This is an American rescue force, and it is 1813.
So, a friendly exchange of conversation, I'm sure.
Well, they left Australia before news of war had reached the Australian territories.
Okay.
So they didn't know they were at war with the Americans. They didn't have any reason to have a grudge against the Americans. But the castaways, including Joseph Holt, stole the Nanina while Barnard was out hunting and declared it a prize of war in the War of 1812.
What a dick. Oh, man.
This... right? Just... You had no reason to steal this.
Yeah.
You weren't at war with them. None of you are soldiers. Most of you fought the British government.
Oh, God. Okay.
They left the Americans in the Falklands to deal with getting themselves rescued. And can you guess where the Nanina sailed next?
England?
The United States of America.
What?
They stole the Americans' boat as fucking war booty, and then went to the U.S. anyway.
I'd like to report a robbery. I don't know if there's a reward.
As a final twist to this whole bizarre story, the Americans were stranded on the island until they were rescued by a pair of British whaling ships that had been diverted when the war ended to find them as part of the Treaty of Paris.
They're just sitting. So there's this major, diplomatic negotiation going on, and somewhere in that treaty there's a footnote, oh, by the way, pick these guys up. And no one had just, okay.
Nobody went looking for them in the meantime. There's, Spanish armadas moving up and down the coast. They never bother to check.
We know those guys are down there, because this guy showed up with their ship stolen.
The 6 guys who took the sailboat did make it to shore and tell the Spanish and the Argentinians that there were people on the islands that needed help. It took 2 years.
Now, granted, this is the age of sail, but, there's a whole lot of, yeah, but I need to put on my shoes, and I don't really want to go to the Falklands today.
Yeah, right? But this is why my sponsors exclusively stock real American harvested seal skins and other fine products of colonial warfare run amok.
In his final days, Alexander the Great's generals asked him who should succeed him. Alexander's answer, the strongest. Taken literally, this would see the close of the classical Greek age, an age thousands of years in the making. Join me, Mark Selleck, as I go back to retell the story of ancient Greece in my series Casting Through Ancient Greece. We will cast our way back to its beginnings, all the way through to the spread of its culture throughout the known world, thanks to Alexander and his generals. You can listen and subscribe to the series at www.castingthroughancientgreece.com, or you can listen on your favourite podcasting platform. Don't forget to follow the series over on Twitter at Casting Greece or on Facebook at Casting Through Ancient Greece. I look forward to seeing you there.
And we're back, now that we've all got a fresh pair of sealskin boots and some delicious, I don't know, tea, nutmeg, classic colonial products. Definitely no wars and or genocides involved.
Quinine and gin.
Yes, there we go.
Yes.
Alright, so we are talking about the Falkland Islands, and funny thing, somehow, the wreck of the Isabella and the capture of the Nanina are not the only intersection between these islands just about as far away from the US as you can get without leaving the Atlantic, and the United States military history.
Go on.
All during this semi-uninhabited period of the early 1800s. So, David Jewett was born in New London, Connecticut in 1772. He was the son of a doctor, with an actual medical degree from Holyoke, which basically made you a magical wizard in the 18th century.
Mm-hmm, that's true.
This doctor was also called David Jewett.
Okay, yeah. Following that grand historical tradition of having one name among 5 people.
Yeah. The elder David enlisted in the Continental Army, rising to the rank of captain as a military surgeon. Okay. And our David set out to study law, decided that was very boring, and enlisted in the teeny-tiny U.S. Navy in 1791.
Okay.
He stayed in the Navy for years, serving in the quasi-war against France, fought mostly because the U.S. refused to pay revolutionary France for the loans they took from the French monarchy.
Sure.
Again, something that will get its own bunch of episodes. David fought in several small naval battles and raids in that totally not a war we swear before it came to an end in 1801, and he was discharged. But he liked being in charge of warships and ordering cannons to blow up other ships, so he became a privateer during the War of 1812.
Oh my, okay.
Ben, do you want to give the brief explanation of privateers for anybody who doesn't know?
So there is a real legal distinction between privateers and pirates, and that's a piece of paper that says that this one isn't a pirate. So the technical legal definition is they got a letter of marque from the government saying that they were allowed to attack whatever country that the other country was at war with. So if the U.S. was at war with Britain, the U.S. government would give them a letter saying that they are allowed to attack British warships. But basically they're pirates. They're, sailing civilian vessels. They don't have training or anything. Yeah. I could go into a whole thing about the rise of professional militaries in the early modern period and what privateers have to do with that, but that's my show.
Yeah, basically, pirate mercenaries whose contract stipulated specific countries they were allowed to do piracy against.
Right. And how well they followed those contracts is sort of how well they thought they were going to get caught, I suppose. Although, by this time, you tended to have to sell your prizes through a court, so they were generally a little bit better about sticking to who they were supposed to be attacking than they had been in the 1600s, sort of.
Yeah, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Francis Drake was a hero. Also, chapter 1 of every book about pirates.
Yeah.
Well, David Jewett decided that he really liked this whole privateering business, So when the War of 1812 ended, he bought another ship and sailed south to find another country looking to hire ocean mercenaries. He went to South America and the great nation of the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata.
Okay.
A country I am sure everyone is familiar with and doesn't need any explanation.
I am, but for the rest of the class...
This, you may have noticed, is not a country that exists today, but that is basically true of every country in South America in 1814.
It was fun times. Lots of people died.
That is the way of things.
Yes.
It's the theme of this show, really.
Fun to read about on Wikipedia, not so fun to live through.
Yeah. Not so fun to read about once you get off of Wikipedia and you get the details, either.
They're not that fun on Wikipedia, to be honest.
That's fair. So, the Rio de la Plata isn't actually a river. It is the estuary between modern Argentina and Uruguay, where the Uruguay and Parana rivers empty into the Atlantic in the same place. This Knot River was the namesake for the Spanish colony known as the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, which officially controlled the kind of middle of South America, but effectively controlled most of Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Argentina, and some of Chile.
And was heavily not invested in. It was kind of a redheaded stepchild of a redheaded stepchild of Spanish possessions.
Part of why the Falklands were left uninhabited for so long is that
Yes.
they would have fallen into the Rio de Plata's jurisdiction.
Most of the economy ran on smuggling.
You know, that could also be said of Boston around the same time.
Boston made a much better go of it, I think.
So, over in Europe, this whole French Revolution business had spiraled wildly out of hand.
No.
The French had gone from just throwing off the shackles of their own monarchy to trying to export their revolution across all of Europe, inadvertently training a Corsican officer named Napoleon Bonaparte to become Emperor of France, and in 1807, like we said, Napoleon invaded Spain, ousted their king, installed his brother, and started a decade-long quagmire trying to rule the Iberian Peninsula on top of everything else Napoleon did.
Generally considered a bad plan.
His inability to control Spain itself meant that Napoleon couldn't actually control Spain's colonies, so you end up with this bizarre sequence of the colonies and viceroyalties all trying to claim to be the legitimate government, and bits of Spain trying to be the legitimate government, and nobody actually being in charge of much, which is how you get a ton of revolutions right around the same time.
Right.
Like I said, Mike Duncan's Revolution, 27-part series on the Spanish-American Wars for Independence, highly recommend.
I would agree with that recommendation.
The important bit right now is that in May of 1810, the citizens and militias of Buenos Aires ousted the viceroy and declared the Rio de la Plata to be a constitutional monarchy.
Hooray!
They maintained the deposed Spanish king as their official head of state, a bit like Canada or Australia does with the British monarchy today, but that only lasted until 1816 and they just decided they were actually independent now. Spanish attempts at reconquest and differing goals between revolutionary factions plunged the new republic into a series of wars, civil and revolutionary, and just generally wars for territory against their new neighbors. Hell, the British even invaded at one point.
It was a lot of fun. A lot of people died.
Yeah. David Jewett arrived with a 40-gun frigate in 1815 and got himself a letter of marque.
Okay.
He spent the next 2.5 years at sea plundering Spanish shipping before returning to Buenos Aires to sell off his booty and his ship in order to fund retirement in the provinces. That lasted all of 3 years before he was contacted by Patrick, aka Patricio Lynch.
Okay.
Because somehow this is a stealth History of Ireland episode. Patricio Lynch was the great-great-grandson of an important tribal leader in Galway in the 1640s, who fought against Oliver Cromwell's genocidal, and yes, it was genocidal, invasion of Ireland during the English Protectorate and the English Civil Wars. This branch of the Lynch family fled to the protection of Catholic Spain in the New World and established themselves as military officers in the Rio de la Plata.
Okay. Okay.
You weren't expecting there to be this many Irish people and Irish rebellions in the Falkland Islands, were you?
I was not, but I'm very pleased because I love Irish history.
So Patricio wanted to get in on the privateering business without actually going to sea himself.
Okay.
So he bribed the United Provinces government to commission David Jewett as a colonel in their army, and then placed David in charge of a new ship called the Heroina to do more Spanish ship hunting.
Okay.
David went back out in March of 1820 and found a merchant ship called the Carlotta, which he attacked and captured, planning to take it and its contents back to Buenos Aires for sale. There was just one problem. Can you guess?
They all got shipwrecked on the Falklands?
Close, but not yet. See, David did the most American thing possible in South America and mistook Portuguese for Spanish. And since the Rio de la Plata was not at war with Portugal, this was an act of piracy.
Oh, God.
The flags don't look particularly similar even in this time period. Ships are well labeled.
I mean, I can conceive of ships would sometimes adopt false flags and stuff, but yeah, that's
if you were a Portuguese ship off the coast of Argentina in this period, why in the world would you fly a Spanish flag?
It could be a Spanish ship that was flying a Portuguese flag.
True, but if you capture a Portuguese ship, you're not allowed to sell it.
Yeah.
It's a bad plan. So, the Heroina hung out at sea for a little while, trying to figure out what to do next. And this lasted for so long that the crew attempted a mutiny, which failed, but David started sleeping with 2 loaded pistols hanging over his bed just in case.
Okay. Seems unsafe.
Like I said, I didn't want to just pass up these stories.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't.
The Heroina and the Carlotta got caught in a storm that October. So 7 months after they set out, I think 5 or 6 after actually capturing this ship.
Okay.
And just panicking.
For months.
But everything was fine because the Carlotta sunk along with all of their pirate booty, and David decided to take the Heroina south to Port Louis on East Falkland for repairs.
Okay. Alright.
By the time they arrived, only 70 of his 200 crew were healthy enough for duty, and David himself was bordering on madness.
Okay. So this wasn't a really successful voyage.
No, not at all. The thing is, David thought the Falklands were still Spanish territory.
Okay.
So when he arrived, he raised the United Provinces flag and declared that he had conquered the islands.
I have to say that I'm not exactly clear on who owns the islands at this point. It's like the British, but they don't have a settlement there?
That is part of the problem.
Okay, cool.
So he claimed the islands, despite the fact that they had been abandoned for 10 fucking years.
Okay.
And nobody lived there to govern.
Sure.
The inhabitants of Port Louis those days were a ragtag assortment of whaling and sealing ships, including the U.S.-American crew of the ship General Knox.
Okay.
As in, friend of the show, Henry Knox, first U.S. Secretary of War.
Cool.
The crew of the General Knox would eventually bring word of this conquest to Salem, Massachusetts, where news of David's piracy and the conquest of the Falklands became public knowledge for the first time.
Okay.
David also accused a different American ship, the Rampart, of carrying Spanish goods, which I assume they were, given the geography of the situation.
I mean, probably.
And he seized it as a prize of war.
So
This is somehow the second time this has happened.
Yeah, okay, I think I see where this is going. If you want to piss off a bunch of New Englanders, you start stealing their stuff.
I promise you don't.
Okay, go on.
He sent some of the Heroina's crew back to Buenos Aires to sell off the ship and deliver a report that conveniently excluded his seizure of several islands on their behalf.
I mean, I'd leave out the accidental piracy, but you leave in the territorial conquest, maybe. But that's not what he did.
Yeah, well, remember, he was explicitly not allowed to do any of this.
Okay, sure.
And capturing an American ship, regardless of what it was carrying, was also piracy.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. And also he's, like, half mad at this point, so...
Yes. So, the Rampart arrives back in Buenos Aires with a letter from David Jewett saying, "Look, I captured this ship for you. Here are the captives and its cargo." And the government is like, "These are Americans. We are not at war with the United States."
What are we supposed to do with these people?
Repatriate them.
Yeah.
With a very embarrassed letter to one of the only countries providing them guns and money.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
So David then pawned off the Heroina to an English captain who had stopped over at Port Louis for repairs, and then he seized an actual Spanish ship for once.
Okay.
And sailed to Brazil.
Okay.
Which is not Buenos Aires.
No, it's, as an American, my South American geography isn't the best, but I'm pretty sure that Argentina is much further south than Brazil.
Yeah. Maybe he mixed up Portuguese and Spanish again.
Yeah, it seems that way.
The irony of this is that his former ship, now crewed by British people, did return to Buenos Aires with news that David Jewett had officially gone off the deep end.
He should have stayed at home, man. This is a lesson to everyone. Don't unretire.
Yeah. The new British captain had this well-outfitted privateering ship, so he also took a letter of marque and also attacked a Portuguese ship, only to be captured and taken to Lisbon as a pirate.
Something about that ship, man. It's just, it really wanted to go to Portugal.
Then Brazil caught the revolutionary fever spreading through the region at the time.
Okay.
So by the time that David Jewett arrived in 1821, it was probably the safest place for him in the world, because it was the one place he could guarantee nobody was trying to sell him out to the Portuguese.
Okay, yeah, sure. I can see that.
So he joined the Brazilian Navy, becoming second in command of the whole joint.
Oh, God.
As a Brazilian admiral, and he led them in battle against the United Provinces during the Cisplatin War.
Those poor Brazilian sailors. Did he win?
He did. They won. Yeah, they won that war. Uh-huh. He was victorious against his former employers, retired, went on vacation to New York City, met a woman, got married, and died in Rio de Janeiro as a Brazilian war hero.
Man, crazy people are very successful generals sometimes.
Yeah. Once he was allowed to attack the Portuguese, he didn't have any problems.
It's just, those Portuguese, they're just so attackable.
Yeah. I'm picturing that meme of the, from, what is it, Predator, of the two hands grabbing one another, and on one side it's David Jewett, on the other side it's, H.P. Lovecraft, and they are joined in their hatred of the Portuguese. God.
The worst part about that is that there's so I'm from Providence, which is where H.P. Lovecraft is from, where he was writing at the time, and there's a very sizable Portuguese population working in the fishing industry at the time. And they're still here. They're great. The food's awesome. But, yeah, H.P. Lovecraft, huge dick. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, this is the point where I do another ad transition before the last page and a half-ish. You probably don't know this, Ben, but I am trying to launch a guerrilla cola war by radicalizing my audience and demanding the return of Coke Cinnamon to replace this spiced abomination they've put on the shelves. So Once again, to the Coca-Cola Corporation, if you meet my demands, I offer you unlimited publicity on this podcast. And until then, RC forever.
Gamarjoba. My name is Roberto, and I would like to sincerely thank you for taking the time to check out my podcast, The History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. In all likelihood, I would venture to guess that you found us because you were searching for either podcasts, YouTube videos, blogs about the history of Georgia, or you're hearing this on another podcast, like this one. I'm both sorry and happy to report that this beautiful and fascinating country is, to my great surprise, criminally underrated in the history world. As of now, this is the only podcast I am aware of dedicated to the full history of a nation and a people that have served as the battleground for empires all throughout European and Asian history. But the land of the Kartveli is so much more than that. The birthplace of wine, the second Christian kingdom, the land of fantastic food, nearly superhuman dancers and musicians, and perhaps, most importantly, a people that have preserved their culture, pride, and independence after centuries of one conquest after another. Empires rise and fall, but Sakartvelo always seems to survive in the end. So, let us celebrate this beautiful land by coming with me on this journey from prehistory to the present day, right here at the History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. You can find us on Twitter at history_Georgia. Sakartvelo is spelled Sakartvelo. Now back to your regularly scheduled podcast.
We are back. I am out of coffee. So we will get through this next bit and finish with part 1 of a surprisingly long history of the Falkland Islands. Alright, so we were just talking about David Jewett, who went on a misadventure of piracy and losing his mind that also sort of accidentally led to the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata annexing the Falkland Islands.
Right.
So we jump back to 1823, just after David Jewett left the islands, and the United Provinces figured, well, he did claim these, so we might as well do something with them. This is where we meet Louis Vernet and Jorge Pacheco. These two met back in 1819 when Jorge was a cavalry officer from Buenos Aires, deeply in debt to the new revolutionary government, and Louis was a businessman from Hamburg in modern Germany, then the German Confederation. Louis had left home following Napoleon's conquest of his city, apprenticed in Philadelphia for a bit, and had established his own trading company in Buenos Aires.
Okay.
Now, Louis was not going to pay off his new friend's debts. That would be far too generous for this first generation of American-trained capitalist. Louis struck a deal with the United Provinces to take on Jorge's debt and handle collection himself, taking a 50% cut when it was all paid back. One of Louis's other side businesses was managing, i.e. catching and butchering, the feral cattle population around Buenos Aires.
Okay, so yeah, he was one of the managed gauchos, essentially.
Yeah, that is exactly where this is going.
Okay.
Gauchos, the class subculture of South American Hispanic indigenous admixture cowboys.
Yeah.
This was actually a booming business during the Revolution, since plenty of farms had been abandoned, and the cattle were just left to run wild, but it couldn't last forever. Fortunately for both of these guys, Jorge's brother-in-law just so happened to be the former commander of the Spanish garrison at Port Louis in East Falkland.
Okay. So he's one of the 12 guys that got sent over to try and stop the revolution.
Yeah, he returned to Buenos Aires and promptly retired.
Probably a good career move.
Yeah, objectively, probably the safest choice that he could have made.
Just, like, get off the boat, look around, there's just, like, people screaming, there's bodies falling out of buildings, things are on fire, and just goes, I'm gonna retire.
El Capitan, these are my 2 weeks.
I'm going to cash in my vacation now! I will see you later.
The medical benefits were shit anyway. But having this relative did provide the intelligence that when the Spanish withdrew, they left several hundred head of cattle and horses behind to run wild, breed, and take over the island for about a decade.
Okay. That seems like an opportunity for someone who's basically already been just pursuing feral cattle for 10 years or so already at this point.
Yeah, if it's the career you're in, like, that's a great untapped opportunity.
Yeah.
So Jorge and Louis organized an expedition to the Falklands. Seeing this as his best shot to get out of debt, Jorge petitioned the United Provincial Government to give him an official land grant and set up his own ranch on the island. And they commissioned another retired army officer to act as the military commander of their new colony, mostly because that would give Jorge the legal standing to raise a militia and lay the foundations for actual recolonization.
Okay.
It wasn't a bad plan.
No, it makes sense on the surface. But then you have to live on the Falklands.
That will be a problem. Their trip there was a catastrophe.
Okay.
One of their ships sank en route. Most of the new settlers couldn't handle the harsh weather or the poor facilities, those facilities being the ruins of several different eras of fort. And the ship captain in charge of their supplies was perpetually drunk. They abandoned the island in August of 1824, 10 months after they left Buenos Aires. It takes about 2 months to get there.
Okay. So again, we're making a really subtle point here. So I want to make sure the audience fully understands that the Falkland Islands are a fairly unpleasant place to live.
Well, Louis Vernet disagreed with you. He still saw potential down south and agreed to buy out both Jorge's stake in the company and Jorge's land grant, allowing his friend to pay off his debt, but go on to serve in the United Provinces House of Representatives and maintain a close friendship and get into more debt with Louis over the following years.
Sure, yeah.
But like comfortable rich guy debt now.
Yeah, okay, it's better. It's restructured.
Uh-huh. So in 1825, Louis Vernet organized a second attempt to resettle East Falkland, this time making sure that the plan, his staff, and the settlers were informed and prepared for life on the island. They made their first cattle hunting trip in 1826, and in 1828, the United Provinces granted an official colonial charter.
So this is an interesting situation where they're a colony of a colony.
Well, an independent republic now, Ben.
Okay, sure, yeah. No, so they're stretching their legs. They're getting their own thing going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think two people in the United States are allowed to talk about colonies of colonies.
Oh, no, we just did straight-up genocidal conquests. Completely different.
We've also got Guam. All those bird shit islands in the Pacific that we claimed purely for their rich deposits of bird shit. That is not a joke.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much phosphate in the world.
Well, we will be using that phosphate soon.
Yes.
So, Louis Vernet set up his large cattle and seal hunting operation with plans to establish a permanent military garrison and a penal colony.
Of course! Was it a private prison?
I mean, this is basically this one businessman's private colony, so yeah.
Awesome. Great.
This all set off alarm bells with the British consulate in Buenos Aires, as their empire had not only been eyeing up the Falklands for some time, but theoretically might have had a legitimate claim, and they really wanted to be able to control the Magellan Straits between South America and Antarctica. Yeah,
in the grand scheme of things, the Falklands are, strategically located and stuff in that time period, if you can stay alive.
Yeah, if you can just park enough guns there. That's really the important part.
Right.
Louis, for his part, doesn't seem to have cared which government actually taxed the islands, so long as they allowed him to make money there.
Of course.
And, fair.
Yeah.
He knows what he's there for.
Yeah.
That is probably a healthy way to approach colonial governments.
Yeah, probably.
So to iron out relations with the British, he sold land to the captain of a British sealing ship and hired a British naval officer as his director of fisheries in 1830.
Okay. This is how we legitimize our colonial regime with the British. We have a British technocrat.
Yeah, we put the British in charge.
You can govern the fisheries. That needs to get managed.
Yeah, all the cozying up with the Limeys had something to do with the fact that his official patrons were somewhat distracted. The northern half of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata erupted into civil war, and any plans the central government might have had for the Falklands were put on hold to deal with that problem.
Yeah, that was another one where it's a lot of fun and a lot of people died.
Yeah, the United Province did not, in fact, deal with that problem, and they spent the next 24 years duking it out to create the modern borders of South America. Back in Port Louis, Vernet's colony was thriving on land and struggling at sea because of the, quote, depredations of the foreigners. Louis was trying to enforce this policy of only allowing licensed seal hunters and whalers in his waters. But he had no naval support to speak of, and sealers from the United States refused to pay any fees.
Here we go. Okay. Yeah.
Because
America.
Louis was still technically an official acting on behalf of a sovereign recognized government and felt that he had every right to enforce this policy with countries that recognize the United Provinces.
Sure.
So in mid-1831, he captured and detained 3 American sealing ships at Port Louis. Unfortunately for Vernet, the crew of one of these ships, the Breakwater, fought off their captors and fled back to the U.S., returning and publishing their story in Philadelphia that October.
Were they out of Philadelphia, or is that just where it was published?
I think it was the first big port city with a large nationwide printing industry.
Okay.
Is, I think, how they ended up there.
These New England cities have very specific whaling and sealing cultures, so I'm always curious as to which one they're from.
I suspect they were from Salem.
Okay.
But they returned to the U.S. by way of Philadelphia.
Sure.
Because that was the first big newspaper they could get to.
Sure, that makes sense.
By that December, President Andrew Trail of Motherfucking Tears Jackson addressed the capture of the ships in his State of the Union letter to Congress, because the State of the Union used to be a piece of paper instead of poli-sci nerds equivalent to the Super Bowl.
Right.
Jackson declared that he would reinforce the U.S. Navy's South Atlantic Squadron to defend American interests and seek reparations.
Against taxation by a legitimate government. Okay. Very Andrew Jackson.
Very American. That we are here because we refuse to be taxed by a legitimate government.
True. Yeah, okay, fair.
And that is where we will pick up in part 2.
Okay.
Ben, your thoughts so far?
Well, you've dug up a couple really wild characters, that's for sure.
I was so surprised as I continued to find these people.
Yeah, this is... And I guess this period, I shouldn't be really surprised, because this period in South American history is full of weirdos like this. That's awesome. I guess the other big takeaway is that the Falklands don't seem like a place that people really want to live.
No. I mean, it really should have been a sign that in, 10,000-ish years of indigenous habitation of the continent, nobody ever bothered to live there.
These Europeans will just jump on anything, I suppose. Try and live there.
On the note of weird characters, I don't know if I'll leave this in this episode, but the series after this is going to include some of the Opium Wars, and Patricio Lynch's grandson shows up fighting in the Opium Wars.
That's great.
I saw the name and I was like, there is absolutely no way.
Some families, man, you just can't stop them. Okay, wow.
But yeah, there we go. Ben, do you want to plug your shows and social media and however people can find you on the internet?
Sure. Yeah, my main show is Wittenberg to Westphalia, The Wars of the Reformation, which you can find at Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast.weebly.com. You go to the website, you can find all my social medias there. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky, which I very much prefer, so check me out. My other show is Why Tho, A Personal Journey Through My Record Collection, and it explores all the records that I own that I haven't listened to. So, it's fun.
And for anybody who listened to the last episode with Bree, if Bree is the Bin Laden of podcasting, Ben is the Abu Musab al-Zarqawi of podcasting.
Well, thank you. And it's not just the view.
For the 11 people who will get every part of that joke, I thank you for listening to all of our many, many podcasts.
Yeah.
All right. You can find more information about this show at secretwarspod.com. You can find me on social media at History of Persia or History of Persia Podcast if it's owned by Meta, because I'm not going to maintain that many social media accounts. And if you want to provide any financial support for this project, by the time this comes out, it might have changed, but you can go to patreon.com/History of Persia, and at the very least, there will be a link to the actual place I want you to go. Until part 2...
Let's go take care of some sheep.
The history of Persia is intertwined with conquest. It began with conquest when Cyrus, king of a small city called Anshan, set out to build the greatest empire the world had ever seen. In a series of stunning campaigns, he achieved just that, becoming one of the greatest conquerors in history, and basically started Persian history. After all, you don't get the title the Great for nothing. But he wouldn't be the last great Persian conqueror. other Persian rulers like Darius the Great, Mithridates I, and Ardashir I would go on to become great conquerors on their own, establishing their own great empires and legacies. If you want to hear their story, and the stories of other great conquerors, many of whom are far less famous despite their great achievements, join me, Ramzi Shalah, on my podcast, The Conquerors Podcast, available on all platforms you listen through.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, A History of Valois Burgundy.